Alright, hello and welcome to this Q&A that I'll be doing today. I just recently passed 5,000 subscribers, which is awesome. Sometimes I look back on starting this Q&A series and realize that my first Q&A series was when I hit 100 subscribers. And I'm like embarrassed because it's like, well, 100 subscribers, like that's nothing. But, it's all relative. I probably will get, hopefully, God willing, might get to a point someday where I think 5,000 subscribers was a really low bar. So it's just been so much of a blessing. I've been so happy to see this channel growing consistently and, growing well, and it's become something that I'm genuinely proud of. So without further ado, we've got 12 questions today that I'm going to answer. On the post where I let people ask questions, there were some duplicates, there were some questions that I had answered a couple times in previous Q&As. Although no doubt someone's going to point out that I'm answering a question today that I've answered in a previous Q&A, and that's fine. I didn't go through all of the previous Q&As to make sure that I didn't answer the same question twice. But without further ado, I'm going to answer some of the questions. Sorry if your question didn't make it. First question comes from Spooncar. He says, what is your opinion on the via media rhetoric? Are you more between Lutheran and Reformed, or between Protestant and Catholic? Also, what is your take on Anglo-Catholic versus Anglo-Romanist terminology? I guess this is two questions. Some of these are actually multiple questions, but I answer the whole comment. Okay, so first off, it's true that there is a kind of shift in what the via media refers to. Some people have pointed out that the sense in which Anglicanism was a compromise in the Protestant period is that the reformers, like I would say Vermigli is kind of like this, or Vermigli, and Cranmer, and some of the other folks. I would say Richard Hooker definitely, John Davenant. You can see where they're trying to, they're taking the best of both the Lutheran Reformation and the Reformed Reformation and defending that as the Reformation. John Jewel, in his Apology for the Church of England, consistently just refers to the Protestant church or the Protestant movement, and he's talking about both the Reformed and the Lutherans, and he claims this is a contiguous entity, and that is consistent in his mind. And you can just see that, people that were influential on the Protestant Reformation in England, like Martin Bucer, were close with Philip Melanchthon, and Philip Melanchthon was trying to kind of create a Lutheranism that could be subscribed to by the Reformed, and he gets the Philippist faction, and then you kind of get Calvin, who's trying to create things like a doctrine of the Eucharist that both the Zwinglians and the Lutherans can subscribe to, and those people being influences both from both of those more moderate versions of each of the Reformation factions, of the two Reformation factions, are the only influences on the Anglican Reformation. So you just get this more moderate Anglicanism. Say, whereas there's a debate over limited atonement, and we'll talk about this more in a subsequent question, in continental Reformed authors, the 39 Articles codify a type of unlimited universal aspect to the atonement where it did actually pay for all of the actual sins of all mankind. So, which a Lutheran would agree with, and the term that they would use would be, I think, universal objective justification. So you get some mixing there. And so, okay, is that what via media means? The middle way is between Lutheranism and Reformed? Well, there's also some stuff which seems like it was a compromise between Protestant reformers and Roman Catholicism. So just the liturgy and the vestments of the period. There was an attempt, and it's pretty obvious in my opinion, to assimilate people who had been loyal to Mary, who was a Roman supporter who wanted to return England to the papacy and successfully did while she was queen. People who supported Mary, to assimilate those folks into the Anglican Reformation. Stephen Gardner believed almost all the doctrines of Roman Catholicism except for the papacy. He wrote some of the books of homilies. He wrote some of the homilies in the books of homilies. So you do get this weird mix. Henry VIII, of course, was more Roman Catholic in doctrine as well. Okay, so you just get this pool of all of these influences. I would even say all three of these influences. In my Anglicanism in 1 minute video that I submitted to Redeem Zoomer, I basically just say it's kind of, in reality, a via media between all three. And this is something that I do want to make a video on when I get the chance, but in the 1800s and the 1900s, you even see Anglicans trying to interact with Eastern Orthodoxy and say, how do we line up here? How do we articulate our positions? And when, and just when the Anglo-Catholic movement shows up, and this will kind of bleed into the Anglo-Catholic versus Anglo-Romanist labels, you get Puseites, people. So there's the Tractarians, right, which is this movement of people trying to recover more of the Catholic heritage of the Anglican tradition. And that in itself, by the way, is a reaction to the dominant evangelical Anglicanism in the Church of England prior to the Tractarian movement. You basically see there's what's called the non-juring schism, where a lot of the high church Anglicans remain loyal to James and the Jacobites. And so when William comes into power, a lot of the high church Anglicans lose their positions, even though they were the majority of the bishops before this, because of political interference in the church. And they just basically continue being their own church, but they're not within the Church of England. It's the non-juring bishops, by the way, and the Scottish Episcopalians who end up ordaining Samuel Seabury for the American Episcopal Church. So, they're still considered part of the Anglican world, and they have their link to the Anglican heritage. Of course, the other bishops that eventually become the first bishops of the American Episcopal Church are ordained by the Church of England, so they recognized each other's orders, yada yada. Anyway, it just shows that in the Church of England there was a dominance of kind of low church evangelical people in the upper echelons. So people were trying to reassert and recodify that high church strain. And so in the Tractarian movement, you do get what I would basically call a split between Anglo-Catholics, who are genuinely trying to just be Catholic, which means universal, having a really high sense of the authority of tradition, okay? And then Anglo-Romanists, who their goal with this movement was to bring the Church of England and Anglican tradition into a place that could be reconciled specifically with the Council of Trent. Newman and Manning and some of these other Anglicans who ended up converting to Roman Catholicism, they are definitely part of the Anglo-Romanist perspective. They just assume or presume, say things like the Catholicity of the Council of Trent, which I would deny. I don't think the Council of Trent accurately represented the pre-Tridentine Catholic Church. I think that there was more ambiguity before the Council of Trent in justification, and I think that the Bible and lots of the best doctors of the church consistently supported what would eventually become closer to the Protestant articulation, because as with all developments of doctrine, prior to, say, the Council of Nicaea, language about the Trinity, Arianism, it wasn't as specific, but the core claim is that before the Council of Nicaea, they still believed in the substance of the Trinity, without the specific language. Same thing, I would say, about justification. Francis Hall, who is an American Anglo-Catholic, who has his Anglican Dogmatics book, you can see on my bookshelf right here, he still believes in the Protestant concept of imputed righteousness. That I would say is a boundary marker for being honest to the Anglican tradition. And Anglo-Catholics who still believe in things like imputed righteousness and can articulate a justification by faith view that is within the boundaries of the Anglican tradition, that's acceptable. I think there is some people who bleed into Anglo-Romanism, though, where they just really desperately want, for the sake of, and part of this is a good desire to see reunion in the church with, say, Roman Catholics. They just want us not to disagree, but I think that's a little dishonest. All right, that was question 1. Question 2 would be, do I affirm what's called hypothetical universalism? The difficulty with answering this question is that there are lots of different views that have been called hypothetical universalism. I would basically be completely confident in affirming what John Davenant articulates in his work on the death of Christ, or De Morte Christi, I think it was originally in Latin, Michael Lynch and the Davenant Press have reissued versions of that in English and translated it, and that translation was very good. And I would basically say that hypothetical universalism, especially as articulated by Davenant, in which the atonement paid the price for all of the actual sins of mankind, is just articulated in 39 articles in Article 2. Let me pull it up and read it. Okay, so this is Article 2, and I believe there are other articles which touched on it as well, but I think this is the place where it is the most specific. So Article 2 is about Jesus, right? Of the Word or Son of God, which was made very man. The Son, which is the Word of the Father, begotten from everlasting of the Father, the very and eternal God, and of one substance with the Father, took man's nature in the womb of the Blessed Virgin, of her substance, so that two whole and perfect natures, that is to say, the Godhead and manhood, were joined together in one person, never to be divided. Whereof is one Christ, very God, and very man, who truly suffered, was crucified, died, and buried, to reconcile his Father to us, and to be a sacrifice, not only for original guilt, but also for actual sins of men. John Davenant appeals to not only the Article 2, which I just read, but also to Article 15, which references John 3, where he talks about who by sacrifice of himself once made should take away the sins of the world. Of course, if you disagree with that reading of John, you're not going to agree with that interpretation of the articles. But he also appeals to Article 31. So then it says here, the offering of Christ once made is that perfect redemption, propitiation, and satisfaction for all of the sins of the whole world, both original and actual, and there is no other satisfaction for sin but that alone. So basically just affirming consistently the view that this is a universal atonement, and for as far as Davenant is concerned, this represents the view of the Church of England because of the 39 Articles, so much so that him and the entire British delegation, when they go to the Synod of Dort, articulate hypothetical universalism as the view of the English Church and of the British Church. He also cites the Heidelberg Catechism as being articulating this universal extent of the atonement. So, which I would agree with as someone who loves the Heidelberg Catechism. All right, now on to question 3. Question 3 from Catfinity8799. Oh, who said the previous question? Question 2, unless I said this already, was Dylan Campbell. Okay, question 3. What are your thoughts on the reprobate having a temporary faith and receiving some of the benefits of Christ? You seem to be still thinking through that question in your discussion with Jonas Saller. He said Joseph Saller, but he means Jonas Saller. And you haven't revisited it. Would you affirm the Lambeth Articles or the Canons of Dort? And this question keeps going. But I'm going to stop here for a second. Okay, I think here's my honest take. And this will come up again and when we're about to talk about the Lutheran view of the Eucharist in a future question, but basically I do think that there is an unfortunate equivocation that happens in the Reformed tradition where when you use the word habit of faith that is given in election, they're talking about that habit of faith as necessary for the reception of the Eucharist. Honestly, for a true reception of the Eucharist that will actually have the body and blood of Christ. Okay. But prior to that, I don't really see that view at all in church history. And there has to be, in some sense, a way in which we can call the object to be permanently linked to the deliverance of the body and blood of Christ. Basically, working through this, there is a distinction, I think, between a natural faith and a supernatural faith. Only God can give a supernatural faith. You see the distinction in Thomism. The supernatural faith can only be given by God, but actually you can come to a natural and temporary faith by reason and other things that aren't the inspiration of God. There's also people who apostatize because they actually did receive real grace from God, and it did actually bring them into a what to everyone around them, including themselves, would seem to be a valid faith, and that's okay for us to recognize that as a valid faith. It is a faith. Obviously, it's not going to, from the perspective of God, he knows it won't persevere, right? But it still has the effects of faith. And I would also say the Anglican tradition, especially in an attempt to reconcile the more objective presence view that I think is pretty common in the Anglican world, I would lean towards saying that right reception of the Eucharist does not have to be supernatural faith. It can be a natural faith or a temporary faith that some people have would be sufficient. So in that moment when they're taking and they do have a temporary faith, that is sufficient for the right reception of the Eucharist. Nobody involved in that situation is sinning by administering the Eucharist in that way. I would basically say the canons of Dort are different than the Lambeth articles. Lambeth articles, if you just read them, they're really not that reformed. People try to overplay, in my opinion. I say this as somebody who in a lot of ways is reformed, but a lot of people really look at the early history of the Anglican Church and they say, oh, look at all this stuff that's very reformed, like the Lambeth articles. But then it's like articles that say stuff like the number of the elect is eternally fixed. Well, which obviously denotes and connotes a very reformed view of this whole predestination before the foundation of the world. But again, even an Arminian thinks that the number of the predestined is fixed by God at the beginning of the world. They're not open theists. They don't think it changes as time goes on. They just think God foresaw faith and all those kinds of things of the elect and fixed it on that ground. So I think I don't have any problem with the Lambeth articles. I think they would have been fine to be adopted. They obviously came with some baggage. And again, the early Reformation Reformed are not the same as John MacArthur Reformed, so in a way, the Reformed tradition was big enough to include the Church of England, in my opinion, when people used that label at the time. But as the label has shifted toward in a different direction, which now includes, say, Baptists that call themselves Reformed Baptists, who up until very recently actually wouldn't have even called themselves Reformed Baptists. They would have called themselves particular Baptists. As the window has shifted, I do think that Anglicanism has unfortunately kind of flopped out because of the things that we should still hold as distinct. And so some people who call themselves Anglicans try to say, oh, look, we're Reformed at the Reformation, which means we're like those Reformed Baptists, which I think is silly in a lot of ways. And the canons of Dort were signed by the British delegation. I think, again, a careful consideration. People, I'm reading through Francis J. Hall's Anglican Dogmatics now, and I'm recording some of the chapters as audiobooks. My hope is to eventually get all of the chapters of the entire work on my Anglican Renaissance Library channel. But I'm reading through that. He has some, in my opinion, misconceptions about Calvinism, which are fine, but he basically articulates the important parts of Calvinism that he just doesn't, because I think at the time and today, there were lots of misrepresentations of what Calvinism was, so, and that's fine. There are lots of people who call themselves Calvinists, who are really within the Reformed tradition, they're Presbyterian or whatever, who do articulate versions that I wouldn't be comfortable with, so it's useful to exclude those people. Okay. The rest of Cat Finity's question, what are your thoughts on the legitimacy of the organization, authority, and sacraments of churches which only have a presbyterial succession, and in some cases have broken the chain of laying on of hands? You said that you affirm a kind of presbyterial succession, but I don't think you ever elaborated much on that. And there's also the complication that past the Reformation era, the Continental Reformed and Lutheran churches could have received the episcopacy from England, but they chose to keep their old system. They didn't intentionally get rid of the episcopacy like the Presbyterians, but they never tried to restore it. These are the questions I've been thinking through myself. Okay. So, I've been looking into presbyterial succession lately, especially as it pertains to Lutherans. And something that I think is interesting or worth noting is there is a much stronger sense of the call in Lutheranism. There is a much stronger need of the laying on of hands. But here's the reality of the situation. I would say, and I've seen people in the LCMS who say this, that European Lutheranism, especially Scandinavian Lutheranism, had a much more thought-out version of this ecclesiology and ordination than the LCMS applies today, which really is congregational. Congregations call pastors now, and they ordain them. And there's less of an ontological sense of holy orders in specifically LCMS Lutheranism than there might have been in historic Lutheranism. Again, there were lots of Lutherans who had the episcopate. in, say, Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, at least pro forma. I don't know if they would have had qualified for maybe a full-bodied apostolic succession anywhere, but Sweden, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltic Lutherans. It's just specifically in Germany where you can see they're regularly in conflict with the episcopate that it is complicated. Even in like Hanover, by the way, as far as I understand, basically there were bishops who every generation, by law, were a Roman Catholic and then a Lutheran, and then a Roman Catholic and then a Lutheran, and then a Roman Catholic and then a Lutheran. And even the LCMS, when they came over to the United States, originally attempted to have an episcopate. They did actually genuinely seek after an episcopate. But then there was drama with the guy who was called, and you can look into that. There was maybe some adultery and maybe him abusing his power. And so then in the American context, in the LCMS and in conservative Lutheranism, they never actually restored the episcopate because of historical complications. And some people have said that the LCMS's specific doctrines on ordination have kind of reacted to that rather than reflecting a pre-LCMS doctrine of ordination. It's been super interesting. I've been looking a lot into it. I'm not sure I've totally made up my mind. But I would, like you said, affirm a kind of presbyterial succession. I think most Anglicans for a long time would have thought of those as valid but illicit. So it's like, I can't recommend you do this. But technically, if we start having a conversation and I realize that's what's been happening, I would still affirm a visible participation in the organism of the church. Because here's ultimately what I don't want to do. And I think this happens sometimes. Some of the Anglican articulations of apostolic succession become a empty legalism. Because unlike, say, Eastern Orthodoxy or these other traditions that have it, which really do just say, like, the important part is that you're contiguous with our institution. You have the bishops because we have bishops, but you also have consistently held to our doctrines and not the other people's doctrines. And doctrine is really what matters, rather than this kind of vain laying on of hands. And what I honestly see so much in even the earlier Anglicans who fought very strongly for the episcopate, they didn't think of the Roman episcopacy as valid because they did think of them as having given up the important doctrines at the Council of Trent. So I don't think they would have seen those ordinations as entirely valid. Now, it's complicated because obviously there were some people who did have Roman ordinations who weren't reordained in, say, the Reformation period. So there is a recognition in that sense, I grant. But it was much more murky. And then you get, as the history of the Anglican Church progresses, the other splinter periods that I'm aware of, say, like the Venetian interdict. So I made a short about this a while ago, but Venice almost became Anglican, but they were in contact. The Church of Venice was placed under a papal interdict because of reforms that they were implementing in the Church of Venice. And so during that period, there was an attempt to come into communion with the Anglican Church, and they even had an Italian Book of Common Prayer issued, and it's still the Italian Book of Common Prayer today. You can find it. They're really rare, obviously. But this happened in the early 1600s, so 17th century. And then again, in France, there was a Gallican movement, which was popular, which would have been basically ecclesiologically Anglican. And even Jansenist, which you can look into Jansenism, much more Protestant version of Roman Catholicism, basically, which eventually got condemned by the papacy. But a lot of French, Roman Catholics were actually Jansenists and Gallicans, and they almost there was an attempt, I guess you could say, it almost would be more of an exaggeration for the Gallicans, but there were lots of people who kind of pushed towards the Anglican area and almost entered communion. And it seems like in those conversations, they would have recognized those post-Tridentine ordinations of those groups as well. So I think there's this idea in apostolic succession, in the Anglican view, that if you have the form of, okay, you are a part of the living organism of the church, and you have the valid beliefs, you have the actual valid apostolic doctrine, you have both, then you have proper apostolic succession. There you are, a valid jurisdiction that we have to respect. And that we're not going to, say, replace your bishops or or give bishops in that area, because we recognize the jurisdiction of your bishops. In our ecclesiology, which is much more precise than, say, a Lutheran ecclesiology, we do believe in the monoepiscopate. So a diocese has a bishop, right? Okay, that's the function of the bishop, is to look over his diocese. He has a crozier, right? Because he's like a shepherd, bashing away the wolves, protecting the sheep. In the sheep, of course, in his instance, are his priests, his pastors, who are the shepherds of their own sheep. Right? They're protecting the sheep, the flock, in their diocese. Okay. All right. That's the function of a bishop, ecclesiologically. The question would be then, does this jurisdiction have a diocese that we acknowledge? And my current stance is, where Lutherans have had apostolic succession, so they have valid bishops, we recognize the jurisdiction of those bishops as dioceses. But say in America, where the LCMS doesn't have bishops, we wouldn't be opposed, and we have consistently placed bishops and dioceses over places where LCMS churches are operating, and that's not a canonical problem, let's say. Okay? However, that doesn't mean we don't recognize, say, the Eucharist on the table at a Lutheran church, because we do believe that they would have the functional continuity with the church in doctrine and in the presbyterate, I would say, to have a valid Eucharist. And I think that consistently in Anglican history, we have recognized Lutheran Eucharist. You can even look, George I in England comes over from Hanover. He's a Lutheran. He brings his Lutheran confessor, and that Lutheran priest, or he would have been called a pastor in Hanover, was recognized as having valid orders and served communion. People partook, and there was no controversy. Versus, if you look up the Kikuyu controversy in the early 20th century, there was problems when Presbyterians celebrated communion and Methodists celebrated communion, and all these other organizations that Anglicans thought that could be heretical. Now, there wasn't exactly a pronunciation of that. There's a bishop in Africa who celebrated communion with Presbyterians or Church of Scotland people, and there was an accusation of heresy. Now, it wasn't settled, but there was an uncertainty there, I guess, that I've never seen happen with Lutherans. Again, you can look at Thomas Bray in the early American period, and he's surveying the American system and what's going on there, and he sees Lutherans, and he is happy that they're operating. John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg, the Muhlenberg dynasty, which were Lutherans at first, actually eventually became Episcopalians, and they completely merged into the Episcopalian system in the early Republic. And that was considered a good thing, an acceptable thing, and they weren't, required to recant what they did as Lutherans. Okay, so there's some presbyterial succession, I would say, pretty consistent view in Anglican history about the Lutherans, because of their strong sense of the call. What would be the worry with Presbyterians, and I think Methodists and, say, Congregationalists and all the other things, would be a diminishment of the doctrine of the call, although I would say Presbyterians definitely have a stronger view of the call, but also not requiring the laying on of hands, which we would see as, the Bible talks about Paul laying hands on Timothy, and that seems like something that's necessary. Paul even exhorts specifically, Timothy, remember when we laid hands on you. That's your call. That's how you knew you were called. So when the Church of Scotland and lots of Presbyterian groups in America and the Methodists stopped doing the laying on of hands, it's like weird. It's like, why even having done that? But because you do that, I think it does seem to us as you could argue actually that that's either an abandonment of the form of succession, the form of the church, right? So it doesn't confer valid orders, or you could even argue that's just an abandonment of an important doctrine about the laying on of hands. Okay. I think that answered that question. All right, next question. Hopefully that helped, Catfinity. And there's some questions that are going to come up that are going to overlap with this issue as well. Spooncar asks, this is a hard question, but we'll talk about this for a second. Are Baptists saved? It seems some Anglicans would say no, because they don't have a valid Eucharist. Okay, that's an interesting question. There's a second half of this I'm tying in another question to this. Koopa Troopa set 1175 asks, Anglicanism is known for being a big tent tradition, which allows for some level of theological diversity. However, I noticed that credo baptism falls outside of the issues in which Anglicans allow for diversity. Why is this the case? By the way, I am a Baptist. Prayerfully considering Anglicanism, I'd appreciate prayers for wisdom and guidance. So, everyone pray for Koopa Troopa. Okay. So, what is the Anglican view on Baptists? And this is an interesting question. I did a stream on this when some of you may know that there was an infamous article about why Anglicans should allow for credo Baptists in communion, or in church leadership, which we don't right now, because we do consider infant baptism as an essential. I think if you're looking for an apology for infant baptism, this isn't the place. I have lots of other videos that touch on that topic. Okay. Why do we hold it as important as we do is the question that's being asked basically here. And then how does this affect us describing the salvation of Baptists? Okay. Fundamentally, and I don't want to become too legalistic because I want to be able to acknowledge this and not be too legalistic. You are saved by Jesus Christ. So, you're not saved by correct doctrine. I do think, genuinely, God has promised to lead by his Holy Spirit the church into all truth. What I think we would say about Baptists, and I think historic Anglicans would have been more consistent about this, we don't believe, so there's the invisible church and the visible church, right? I would say that as far as most traditions go, we hold these things the most consistently. I think there are lots of Protestants who basically fall into saying the invisible church is really the only church, and visible churches only exist insofar as they relate to the invisible church. Baptists pretty much explicitly believe this because they don't even want to baptize somebody if they think you don't have enough warrant to think that person is a part of the invisible church. Whereas I would say the Anglican view is that there is this thing that is the visible church, which has all of these marks that include an organic apostolic connection, and all of these visible forms, the three offices of the church, etc., which if you don't have, you are not a part of the visible church. I think that is pretty consistently taught in the Anglican tradition, let's say, as well as apostolic doctrine. Okay. So, what Baptists don't have is the visible church. So, when you're talking about not having a valid Eucharist, again, it does seem to me like if you went the farther back you go into the Anglican tradition, before people start to get the creep of liberalism, in my opinion, they would have just said, yeah, Baptists are heretics. They wouldn't have said Baptists are kind of just wrong about a little thing. They would have said, yeah, you're denying all these things. Baptizing infants, in our opinion, pertains in large part to the visible church, not the invisible church. So, I think it's George Henry Gerberding, who's a Lutheran, who wrote The Way of Salvation in the Lutheran Church, has a good way of articulating this, and I think a way that's digestible. Basically, we would say it is condemnable sin to not baptize your babies. It's harsh, but that's just the consistent position, I think, of the real belief in original sin and the belief in infant baptism as a commandment of the apostles, which they're forgetting. Which, by the way, Credo Baptists consistently think the reverse is true. They think, we have the apostolic doctrine, you are not doing it, you're sinning. That's fine. That's how disagreement works theologically. So the same is true the other way. On the other hand, what I would also want to say is that there are lots of people who I know who have serious relationships with Jesus, and they give me evidence of their election, is the way I would put it. And so I don't deny. I wouldn't, in the same way that I would say a Jehovah's Witness, say, you need to leave Jehovah's Witness, dumb, or whatever, leave your kingdom hall. There is no salvation in the Jehovah's Witness kingdom hall. You have to leave. Or say with a Mormon. I would not say that they're in the same category at all, because they are Nicene Christians. So, that's basically my summary of the situation. Basically, the way I would also articulate this is, in Acts 10, there are a group of Christians who are converted in Jerusalem, and then they disperse from Jerusalem, and they go to Antioch, and they start a Christian community there. And they baptize people. And we don't get, or it's implied they started this Christian community, there's some baptisms. Barnabas shows up, the apostles hear about this Christian community in Antioch, and they don't just say, great, cool, glad that exists over there. They're going to do their own thing, disconnected from us. They're not Congregationalists, in my opinion. The apostles aren't. They send Barnabas to go to Antioch and lay hands on this community, which I would say is things like ordination. We can talk, I'll do a whole video on the idea of laying on of hands. But they lay hands on people, which I think is ordinations and confirmations and all the other kinds of things. They recognize their baptisms. Baptists' baptisms are valid. Mormon baptisms are not valid, right? So, in that sense, Baptists are in a much better space, I guess we would say, pretty strongly than these other groups. But the reason we don't allow for credo baptism in our church is because we do believe it's a denial of a key element of the visible church. When we are having a visible church, you have to agree on what the visible church even is. It's a serious error, is what I would say. Question 5. The last one was like a lot of questions, and there's lots of questions. So the numbering, don't be too particular about the numbering. But this is question 5 from Jama 8281. Strongest disagreements with Lutherans outside of apostolic succession. That's a question I've been looking into a lot lately, man. I would say outside of apostolic succession, I think Lutherans and Anglicans are the closest. I wish there was more consistency there. I do see in a lot of ways. I would just say that where the Lutherans lack in ecclesiology, they really just don't have a lot of strong ecclesiological doctrine. The Anglicans do have a lot of very strong ecclesiology. But where the Anglicans don't really have as consistent and codified, say, like the Book of Concord, which is, I think, very well articulated, and I really have a lot of admiration for the Lutheran tradition. That's why I don't have a Why I'm Not Lutheran video. I think Anglicans can learn from that. I always wish that when like Anglicans make dogmatic texts, treating the Book of Concord as much, as a seriously important document, in the same way that there's like those Anglo-Romanists, who we were talking about earlier, who try their best to make Anglicanism square with Council of Trent. I wish there was more of that with the Book of Concord, because I think if there's ever going to be reunion with Anglicans and Lutherans, which I actually really would think would be a positive for the church, it would look like Anglicans acknowledging the authenticity of the Book of Concord, because I don't think Lutherans are going to give up the Book of Concord, and I don't blame them for that. So, yeah, hard to answer question. Hopefully that was helpful. All right, question 6 from Professor Dropkick. If given the opportunity, should the Orthodox Anglicans move forward towards communion with Rome, not merger, despite the fundamental theological differences? I think there's a difference between communion with Rome and accepting the validity of each other's orders and Eucharists. Like I said before, I think there's a pretty consistent view in Anglicanism that Roman ordinations are valid, and therefore Roman Eucharists are valid. But our ecclesiological bodies are not in communion. Like, we don't think of them as Orthodox Christians. They don't think of us as Orthodox Christians. And I would even say, so back to that whole diocesanal example I gave, and this was a debate, so keep in mind this isn't as hard cut in Anglican history, but in Mexico and the Philippines and even in Jerusalem, there already were Roman Catholic dioceses with bishops that claimed jurisdiction. Even in America, although the Anglican diocese in America predate the Roman Catholic diocese, so even if we did recognize them, we would just think they're in the wrong. But clearly they don't think our dioceses are valid, okay? And they can overlap, okay? We have started to move, I would say, in the 19th, 20th century into having dioceses in places where there already are Roman Catholic dioceses, which to me shows that we don't think they have the apostolic doctrine. We think it is valid. Jurisdictionally, their bishops don't have valid jurisdictions. So, would it be sinful then, in that situation, I think, to take communion at a Roman Catholic church because the priest doesn't actually have valid jurisdiction? It would be basically illicit, but valid. Like, the communion, you would actually be receiving communion, but it would be illicit, especially if there is an Anglican church nearby with Orthodox doctrine as well. But then there's like the whole emergency situation. So the way that like Roman Catholicism sees Eastern Orthodoxy, where if you're in an emergency and you can't take communion from a Roman Catholic church on Sunday and you have to meet your Sunday obligation, you can take communion at an Eastern Orthodox church. Now, the Eastern Orthodox don't let the Roman Catholics take communion at their churches, so that's all hooey, I guess. Basically, that kind of recognition between Rome and Anglicanism, I would accept if we just accepted the validity factually of each other's Eucharists. I do think we would still have to maintain a kind of illicitness. So, like, it's illicit to take communion from a Roman Catholic Church when you can still take it from an Anglican church, especially if you're a confirmed Anglican. And as, by the way, the more I look into this, the more in favor I am for a kind of closed communion. Not a totally closed communion, like, say, the LCMS, but I think that's we need to be more strict with who we administer communion to. Anyway, so, not just a specific dig at the Roman Catholics. Okay. Question 7. From Julia Klein at 99217. What is your view on the Rosary, Catholic and Anglican versions? Is it a sin to pray the Rosary, and the Hail Marys are the Hail Marys good prayers? So, people will talk about the Anglican Rosary, and I have an Anglican Rosary, and I'm about to get another Anglican Rosary from a friend. So the Anglican Rosary is different. It doesn't include prayers to Mary, but it is tactily a good thing. I think, and there are Lutheran rosaries as well. So the idea of a prayer bead thing is good. I think those are very good, and actually have helped me in my spiritual life a lot, immensely. So in that sense, they're good. I do think prayers to Mary can be distracting, and an over-enlarged Mariology is just functionally problematic rather than strictly theologically evil, right? So I think with a lot of the issues that, say, we would have with Roman Catholicism is you start with a good practice, so a recognition of the communion of saints, that those who are dead are actually alive in heaven, in Christ, and that they're really being incorporated into the tapestry of the remaking of the kingdom of God, all that stuff, okay? Then, and this is what people don't, and so then it's like, okay, can I pray to a saint? I actually think you could. I don't think that's horrible. I don't think it's an ipso facto problem, and when it starts, I don't really see people in church history debating about it. So, like, with icons, secular historians say, here's when this practice shows up, and then there's conflict about it. There's the iconoclasm controversy. So both sides could debate that the other side, of iconoclasts and iconoduals could argue, look, this other group was brought into being at this point, and it caused controversy because the Orthodox Church, whichever side you agree with, reacted negatively to the other view. Okay, fine. I don't see that as much with prayers to the saints. What I think ends up happening, though, is combined with the Roman Catholic view of the treasury of merit, whereby Mary's merits are a part of remission of your temporal debt of sin, and that's part of, and I don't think, the Tridentine Roman Catholic Church wouldn't deny this, prayers to the saints, part of that is, in theory, a supplication on behalf of the merits of those saints towards God, which I think we would disagree with as Anglicans. So I think almost doing the practice, it kind of slowly evolves into something bad without you noticing. And it also just diminishes the centrality of Christ in your prayer life, which I don't see as a bad thing. I think the more you are praying to Jesus, the better. There is nothing you can get from praying to another saint that you wouldn't get from praying to Jesus. Pray to Jesus. Pray to God directly. No downsides to that. Now, again, there's a very watered-down version of this that Catholic apologists give today, which is just about praying, asking your friend to pray for you. And in that sense, as far as that is applicable, it is acceptable in my opinion. But that isn't actually the full Roman Catholic view, in my opinion, about what's going on with the life of the saints. There's the treasury of merit tied up in this, and that is bad. And we disagree with that. And even to some extent, by the way, Eastern Orthodox disagree with the idea of the treasury of merit. So that is a peculiar Roman Catholic doctrine that is not good. And the Eastern Orthodox do still pray to saints. So, complicated issue. All right, question 8 from Keenan Morris, 5934. What would you say is too high church? Is there a point where you can have too much adiaphora? And how much can you stray from the prayer book and still be an Anglican service? I think this is a good question. I think as far as the broad label of high church, I don't really think there's something that's too high church. Because you could just get more reverent and more candles and more beautiful. And that would be always good. Beauty is a good thing. Okay. But I do agree that there are people who use non-BCP prayer liturgies that are just modifications. I believe there's an Eastern Orthodox slight modification of the BC prayer service, which actually isn't that bad, but it's like the Lancelot Andrews Press version, which is not really that different than the one we have, but they do change some wording of things. There's the Anglican Missal. playing around with those, I think, starts to be dishonest to the Anglican tradition, because the liturgy has been so central to our tradition. So straying from the BCP is a bad sign for me. I do think there are, like I said earlier, people who just want Anglicanism to be reconcilable with the Council of Trent, and I see that, and I think just from a practical perspective, there's almost no point to Anglicanism at that point. All right, question 9 from Gwoog55. Love to see Gwoog. Gwoog is always in my comment section. I really always appreciate his comments. He's always in my live streams as well. Okay, where would you say you are at right now in regards to Eucharistology? What is your view of the presence? I touched on this earlier, and I think, and maybe other people can relate to this, but I recently have been looking into like Richard Hooker's view of the Eucharist. I bought the Davenant Press has a modernization of his. It's from Book 5 of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, where he talks about it, and he basically just articulates the Reformed view, and argues against ubiquity. And I just don't see all the problems with ubiquity that everyone else in the Reformed tradition sees. And I do think there is a sense in which you can square the Lutheran view with the 39 Articles. I've made an Instagram post about this. I can maybe do another video if people are interested. And, I see that. But also, even Richard Hooker, who's arguing for the Reformed view, basically says it is a mystery that we can't explain totally. And he says, basically, if I have to explain it, here's how I would explain it. But even he's not that confident in his articulation as being the definitive one. And I would say, if you just look at church history, the way that it's described before, the modern era, even in the West, is like comparing it to the Incarnation. Okay? Which, right, in the Incarnation, there's two natures, united in one person. Okay? So two substances, basically a divine and a material one. How do you square that? That's a mystery. And almost the fact that the sacraments are called mysterion, or mysteries, I used to be a little bit more interested in defining a view. I really just beginning to lean more and more towards mystery, and towards insisting on an objective tie or presence to the elements, which I do think is honest to the Anglican tradition. Sean Luke has a good articulation of his compilation of the Anglican view, and I had him on my channel a while ago to talk about that, and you can see that video if you want to know more. All right, question 10. Luke Bowman 08 asks, how long should someone study before changing denominations? Should there be a longer amount of time for a Protestant becoming a member of an ecclesialist church versus joining another Protestant denomination? I think people don't study enough, as much as they should. I even went through periods of doubt and just kind of slowed down and tried to stick through it. And every single time I've done that, I've remained Anglican, because the core convictions that brought me here eventually renew themselves in my conscience. And I rather than looking at one issue where I'm having a lot of struggle with, which tends to be what happens, is you have one problem with the current tradition that you're in, and you see other traditions which don't have that problem, or which solve that problem, or have a view preferable to the one that seems obvious to you. And for that specific issue, it would be solved if you were in that other communion. But that will shift in importance to you as time goes on, and you'll realize, wait a minute, all these other things, which were the reasons that I'm in this tradition, were actually important. So I would say, honestly, before changing a tradition at all, take like a year. Like, really take a year to study, because you don't want to denomination hop. You want to really live out whatever situation you're in, especially if you just recently arrived in Christianity, or in confessional Christianity from, say, non-denominationalism, which I would tell you just to get out of non-denominationalism. Really sit there. And there are traditions that I really disagree with, say like being a Baptist. I wouldn't say just leave. Really think about it. Really study the scriptures. I do think the scriptures are perspicuous on the issues I disagree with Baptists on, and so I'm confident in saying, just take your time and look through the issue. And I think you'll be convinced of the Anglican position. Fine. That's okay. I do think there's probably more warrant for taking more time, I guess, with traditions that are more different than the one that you're coming from. But I would say, just in general, about a year would be good to really study the issues that you're having trouble with. Okay, question 11 from Cairo Anglo Bro. Great name. Okay, would you ever move from the ACNA to a continuing Anglo-Catholic church? I think here's my criticisms of the continuing churches in general. And then this is going away. If the continuum morphed into and really started to live out a unified life and became one Anglican province, and fixed canonical overlap and boundaries, and had significant dioceses and was a coherent organization, it would make them more likely. So that would have to happen on that side, and the ACNA would have to start dogmatizing things I don't believe, say like women's ordination, and then I would feel compelled to leave. I would also support, and I'm not advocating for this, but I'm saying if this happened, I would support it. If the conservative ACNA dioceses end up leaving the Anglican Church of North America because of problems, and they, as a whole, like say my bishop joined the continuum, I would support my bishop in doing so, follow my bishop in doing so. But again, I'm not saying that should happen. I'm just saying if that happened, I would be fine. Okay. Question 12. This is the last question. Thanks so much for all the questions, guys. This comes from Philip Wood Finn NB7UD. Do you think much of YouTube channels stressing theology or a particular tradition can be an idol and be more of a country club as opposed to actual faith? The answer is yes. I do think that is serious. If people have been following my channel for long enough, I really actually was burdened by this feeling a while ago. I changed my YouTube name briefly to Sub Umbra rather than being Anglican because I was like, this is so bad. People just really idolizing the traditions that they come from, and I think that can be really bad. I do think that can be really bad. The reason that I've gone back to being more okay with it is twofold. One, I do think there's kind of an identity crisis today, and so because I think for a variety of reasons American identity is being de-emphasized and becoming less coherent, people want identity in lots of other places. I think this is happening in the secular world with, say, LGBTQIA whatever plus identities, where people are picking those and then that becomes their community. And you can literally just see online communities, websites, Tumblr things devoted to giving space for this person. So all you have to do is be that person, and now you've got this space where there's all these people who feel like you and think like you and share your values. And that is good. We should actually want community in that way. The problem is when that does become an idol, like that sense of community is weaponized to make you believe falsehoods and to make you hurt yourself, like it does oftentimes in the LGBTQIA whatever world. So they can become idols, and I don't think they actually do. And what we should be able to do at the end of the day is refocus, especially as Christians. So back to the Christian denominations, it's like you're an Anglican, you're a Lutheran, you're a Presbyterian, you're a Roman Catholic. Sure, and you probably are those things because you really believe it, and I don't doubt that. So, but still be able to recenter your life on Jesus, because that's the thing that actually matters at the end of the day. When you get to heaven, God isn't going to ask me how much I defended the Anglican faith because it was Anglican. He's going to ask me how well did you, he's going to go, how much did you love Jesus? How much did you share Jesus? How much did you share the truth? I think the truth matters. And so the reason I'm Anglican isn't because of some loyalty to the ideas, but because I think that it is closest to the apostolic doctrines, which are important. I think that's going to be a part of it, but it's all going to be about Jesus at the end. If I was truly measured on my merits, I would fail, right? At the end of the day, before the judgment seat of God. And it's only because of Jesus that I'm going to be welcomed into His kingdom. So I think this is a problem, and we should allow this to remind us to recenter ourselves and emphasize what actually is important. Thank you so much. What a great question to end on. I think that was a good summary. If you have any more questions for me, you can ask them in the comment section here. If you liked the video, be sure to hit the little like button, a little thumbs up, and give a like and give feedback. That really helps the videos do well. If you want to see more of my content, you can subscribe, hit the little bell button, and you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. if you want to support me financially, I can afford to do more of this stuff and get more equipment and fill this bookshelf with more books. You can always support me over at younganglican.locals.com. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.